Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Blake Crouch is one of horror's modern masters of original words. Whether for his famed Wayward Pines series, frightening enough for Time magazine to decide that they merit mention in the same company as the Duffer Brothers' Stranger Things. Incidentally, the brothers worked on Crouch and M. Night Shyamalan's adaptation of the hit trilogy for Fox TV over 2 seasons, indicating the guidepost this groundbreaking sci-fi horror vision laid for where things were heading in the future of both genres and their ever-popular hybrids. Jack Reacher franchise creator Lee Child would declare after reading him that I think Blake Crouch just invented something new. A recurring theme throughout the trail is blazed with a career that continues to deliver hits like his Andrew Z. Thomas Luther Kite series featuring Desert Places, Locked Doors and Break You, and hit standalones like Stirred, Abandoned, Famous, Snowbound, Run, Eerie, Good Behavior, and the sensational smash hit Dark Matter that NPR warned fans was a jet-propelled science thriller USA Today promised would be a hard tale to shake, while the Wall Street Journal hailed it as a story that draws on questions and anxieties we all wrestle with in the dark hours. Crouch has invested sci-fi motifs with scientific plausibility and more unusually with emotional depth. Covering all the bases a book should, Blake's success streak continued more recently with new hits like Recursion, which blew the New York Times away as a time-twisting, mind-bending novel, while Entertainment Weekly celebrated his newest noir-infused, Netflix-bound science fiction thriller that breathes fresh life into the matters with a mix of heart, intelligence, and philosophical musings, as the reader is invited to ponder the importance of memory to, well, everything. Recursion is definitely one not to forget when you're packing for vacation. Crouch's latest smash, Upgrade, was scooped up by Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment for developing when Deadline broke the news. Crouch will adapt the screenplay and is also attached to executive produce beside Spielberg. Sources say the auction was highly competitive, with several other studios and streamers in the mix, before Amblin ultimately won the bid. Crouch is an international best-selling author whose work has been translated into 40 languages and has sold millions of copies. Past screen adaptations of his work include Wayward Pines, which he executive produced alongside M. Night Shyamalan for Fox, and Good Behavior for TNT, which starred Downton Abbey's Michelle Dockery. Upcoming, Crouch's best-selling novel Recursion sold to Shonda Rhimes and Matt Reeves at Netflix, and will be developed as a TV and movie franchise. And Crouch is also adapting and executive producing Summer Frost. He takes out time from his light-speed schedule in Aurora, Colorado to spend time with us today. Blake, thanks for being here. Wayward Pines. This sounds like, from the town name alone, like one you might break down in on a road trip and never visit again. Maybe the locals gave you the creeps or just the remoteness. And this is actually a very idyllic town on the surface of it all in the book series. And will go on to play such an important role as a character in the book. Was it based on a real town that you traveled through or lived in that gave you the creeps, or even one that things just didn't seem quite right with after you stayed there for a night?
I moved to Colorado in 2003, and for the first 10 or so years here, I would go to this little town north of here called Ouray. I'd go to this town with my family called Ouray, Colorado. It's about 70 miles north of Durango, where I live. And this town is surrounded by mountain cliffs. The road into town from the south comes off this really high pass and comes down into town. And, like maybe 400 or 500 people live there year round. Very quaint Victorian houses, cute Main Street, coffee shop, candy store, tourist stuff, and just surrounded by spectacular scenery. And I'd go there, several times a year. They had these hot springs that are famous there. And one night I was out walking and I heard a phone ring, sort of echoed off the valley, off the mountains. And then another phone rang, and then another phone rang. It just sounded really weird, these 3 phones ringing and the sounds of their, the sounds of them like echoing. And for whatever reason, I just had this weird thing went through my head. It's like, what if they're calling each other about me? What if I'm not supposed to be here and this is some kind of a weird community and they're all going to come running out of their houses trying to find me and track me down? Like, what if a whole town mobilized and came after me? And I didn't know why I was there. I don't know why they were doing this, but I just thought that is a really interesting premise. And I kicked the idea around for a long time.
As his first burst of inspiration evolved in that time and you began populating the town with locals and the outsiders who walk in, namely Secret Service agent Ethan Burke, in search of missing colleagues. And as he does so, it's into another dimension that the Hollywood Reporter rightly called terrifying for anyone newly learning about its existence. Crime Rates would open that examination with their observation that Crouch writes like a madman, single-sentence paragraphs, one after the other, hyperkinetic pacing, mind-blowing high concepts. There are so many genre mashups going on here that it's a little hard to describe. We have time travel, a dystopia, monsters, a love story, and a whole mess of other goodies all wrapped up in this breakout bestseller. Please unravel for viewers the mystery of how it all came to life once your imagination was committed.
Came up with this idea of a Secret Service agent who's coming to this remote town. I moved it to Idaho because I wanted it to sound even more remote. He's looking for his missing partner, and he gets there, and then all these crazy things happen. I literally made a list of like all of the genre tropes, and I was like, how many of these can I squeeze into the first 100 pages just to keep the audience completely guessing? Amnesia, guy on the run, looking for someone who's missing, the notion of being kidnapped, the notion of people behaving strangely for no discernible reason. And I loved all this. And I knew the first 100 pages were going to be amazing, but I had no idea what any of it meant. Literally no idea what any of it meant. I didn't know why these people were acting weird. I didn't know why this town was here. I didn't know why he couldn't leave. And in the past, like with some of my earlier books, I had kind of rushed in and started writing before I knew really what I was doing, and it had suffered. And I was like, I'm not going to do that this time. So I went off and did some other things, and but I would keep coming back to these journals how I write. I kind of take notes, and finally, one day, I had this just crazy epiphany, and I'm not going to spoil what the reason behind all of it is. But I thought that is so cool. And I'm so glad I didn't start writing this book until I realized what the big mystery behind this town was. But once I knew what it was, I started trying to create a comic book out of it.
A comic book? Wow, so originally it wasn't intended to be a novel. Was it more like a graphic novel as that idea evolved? And when did the book finally feel like the right format for this masterpiece?
The guy couldn't make the deal with his bosses. And finally I was just like, fuck it, I'm going to write the novel instead. And went off and wrote the novel, and that's it. Rest is history.
Well, the book certainly made history in the entirely original way that USA Today noted you mine the shadier corners of science and humanity to move the story along. Who are a few of your favorite locals within the town to do so with?
I love Nurse Pam. I think she's a blast. I love Pilcher. I really loved writing the Hassler sections. I think he's a fascinating character.
Focusing in a bit on the narrative approach you took to telling Agent Ethan Burke's backstory, from his war service to his family with wife Teresa and son. Why did writing from the third person point of view make so much sense here?
For whatever reason, each story and book I try to take on, it wants a certain point of view to tell the story. And I don't always know it. Often I'll be 100 or 200 pages into the book and realize I'm writing in the wrong POV. But yeah, I don't know. It just seemed what the book called for.
When you decided after the first book you were going to sit down and write the second with Wayward, Ethan Burke is now sheriff and in possession of the secret of expand the playing field, so to speak, of new places you could take the sequel. The town. How did his possession of that knowledge allow you to expand the playing field, so to speak, of new places you could take the sequel?
I needed him to be on the inside. The entire premise of the first book is being on the outside of the information and trying to figure it out. So what I wanted to do was quickly build out the mythology of the town, and I needed my main character to be able to understand all of it. And I really liked the tension of him knowing everything and not being able to tell his family, not being able to tell anyone. I just like the progression from outside the circle to inside the circle.
One place everyone here definitely wants to stay inside is the safety of the town, given the creepy creatures called the Abbeys that you crafted to await those who leave its safe confines. And they scared readers and reviewers equally, with TV Guide calling them creatures that would send a chill down anyone's spine. Did they send one down yours as you were conjuring them up for the story?
Heard them in the imagination. Could imagine, when Ethan walks up to the fence and hearing those crazy, guttural shrieks coming from the forest. That just immediately painted this really interesting visual image in my mind.
What about writing from the headspace of billionaire mad scientist David Pilcher, who acts as something of an evil Oz running the town behind the scenes?
He's god of the town, and not a very good god. I think I was also I was raised in North Carolina in the Bible Belt, and I was kind of trying to come to terms a bit with what I really thought of the notion of God and religion. And in some ways, I don't think I really knew it at the time, but in hindsight, it's pretty clear that like Weird Pines is sort of a bit of a metaphor just for belief and for what religion does to us. It says, here are the boundaries and here are the rules. Without giving any real information. It just says, you don't worry about what's beyond the fence. Don't worry about what happens when about the end things that you don't understand. Just trust your benevolent overlord.
By the time we arrive at the third book in the trilogy, The Last Town, this is really the most blatant horror novel of the three in the classic sense of the word. Was that the planning all along?
A lot of series and the reason I don't really gravitate towards writing series is I find that typically they get repetitive very quickly, just as a blueprint, and some things change. What I wanted to do with Wayward Pines is I wanted to make a trilogy, but I wanted each book to be a different genre, if that makes sense. So like Pines is a psychological thriller. Wayward has a lot of characteristics of a police procedural. It's set in a crazy environment. And the last one is pure horror.
Were you ready to wrap things up by the third book, or sad to say goodbye to the good folks of Pines?
No, it was hard. I was pretty burned out on the series, both the book and the TV show at that point in time. So that was a struggle to get that one done. And, I was constantly, because there were so many things I could see myself doing with the series. I mean, for a hot minute, it was going to be 6 books. I saw so many other things beyond the town I could have brought in. And I think that really messed me up for a while. And then I just realized, hey, just keep it focused, keep it contained. End the stories that you've started. Don't keep opening new ones. Let's leave people wanting more instead of having them get tired of a series. So once I realized that, it became a joy to write.
Once you were making decisions about who would survive and who wouldn't, without giving too much away, how early on did you decide to bring Adam Hassler back for a starring role in this third novel?
His name is based on my best friend from high school, who's also Adam Hassler. It's just, he's one of my favorite characters. He's the nomad. He was out beyond the fence. He's seen everything, and seeing him get to come back and sort of tell his story and step back into the town, his whole thing with Teresa. I loved all that. It was one of my favorite parts of writing that, aside from the very end.
Looking back on it now, why do Wayward Pines feel like the right name for the series?
There is a small subdivision near where I live that's called Whispering Pines that I used to drive past all the time. So that must have made some sort of an imprint on me. Weirdly, I did not name the book. I was calling it Psychosis at the time, because I thought the main character was obviously going through some kind of psychosis. And my friend Brian Azzarello, the comic writer who I was talking to when I was trying to kind of get this thing going at Vertigo, he was like, you should just call it Pines. I was like, that's a really good idea. In hindsight, I wish I had named the first one Wayward, the second one Pines, and the third one Last Town, but
How surreal was it when the call came that M. Night Shyamalan and Fox wanted to adapt the books into a TV series starring Matt Dillon in season 1 and then Jason Patric in season 2? And how involved were you in the teleplay adaptations? It must have been a trip to see such iconic actors bring these roles fully to life, let alone the CGI with the characters that the Abbeys played. Once
they do, it's fair. It's sort of like they own the character. Then it's not like you can't write it, but you can't ever really divorce yourself from their embodiment of the character to what you had in your head. Because I was still writing Weird Pines when the series, when we were filming, and Matt had been cast, and it's very hard to get that voice out of your head when you're writing Ethan Burke. It's just a very it takes over the character. I'd never been on a film set before, really been involved with the production, so it was all just exhilarating and huge learning process. Learned a bunch of cool things of what I loved and what I didn't love and didn't want to do in future production. So it was an amazing crash course in this business. It just gave me a real sense of when you're writing something for film and television, like everything you put on page, someone has to build this and it has to look good. And it just gives you an understanding of what an incredible team of people it takes to bring something like that to life. Way before your books were being turned into movies and television series, what were any of those that you yourself watched as a kid, and any books that you really got excited about reading early on? The Hardy Boys, I read those in elementary school. My mom was a big reader to us. Like she'd sit and read things out loud. So she read the uh, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Chronicles of Narnia, A Wrinkle in Time. Those were my earliest memories of pleasure reading, because around the same time I started telling my younger brother bedtime stories.
To be clear, these are stories of your own you were making up.
Yeah, I would make them up. One it's called The Castle on the Hill, and it was about this little kid who lived in this idyllic sort of neighborhood in this town, and there's a big hill that sort of overlooked the town. There's a big scary castle, and a mad scientist lived in the castle. And like one night, the big storm came, and there's lightning and thunder, and the little kid was scared, and he fell asleep. And when he woke up, he wasn't in his room anymore. He realized he was somewhere inside this castle. And this story kept evolving and getting more intricate, and the scientist was chasing him around the castle, and it was and my brother loved it, and I ended up even writing it down. I still have it printed out somewhere, printed out from on the old dot matrix printers. You remember those?
So that establishes how early your mind was already beginning to create its own creative landscape to draw a muse from. How influential were movies, maybe within the horror or science fiction genres, during the same time in your childhood?
I loved all of the horror movies, the 80s. I'd go over to my friend's house and watch them on HBO. Yeah, 2 a.m. That's where I saw Return of the Living Dead for the first time. But yeah, I think in a weird way, television was probably a bigger impact, especially like Twin Peaks. When that came out, that really blew my mind and definitely set me down a certain aesthetic path.
Hearing that legendary show as an influence makes sense too, given the genres you go on to bend and blend in your own original ways in books to come. Beyond your younger brother, were your friends and your teachers starting to become part of that listening and reading audience?
First, my mom was I was homeschooled until 6th grade, and she did this really interesting thing, which I didn't understand at the time, but was pretty powerful in retrospect. She would have me, and part of it was helping me learn how to like type, but I would type like actual pages from like some of the books we were reading. So we were reading Lord of the Rings. My assignment might be to like type out 2 full pages exactly as Tolkien wrote or C.S. Lewis. And it was a really interesting practice in terms of writing good sentences. Even though I wasn't coming up with them, I was writing them and starting to understand as I hunt and pecked how they were pieced together. And then in middle school, I had a teacher named Miss Bumgarner, and she'd given us an assignment to write a short story. And I wrote this super fucked up story about a guy who he comes home and he turns on the news and his wife isn't home yet. And on the news, they're covering the story of this massive car pileup, and the cameras are there. I mean, it's not really believable, but the cameras are there, and one of them passes over the face of his wife, and she's dead, and he gets super upset and ends up killing himself. And then just as he like rises above his body as the spirit, his wife rushes in. He was wrong. And anyway, she called a teacher conference for obvious reasons, kids 7th or 8th grade writing about suicide. And she was like, I just have to understand, first of all, you're okay, right? Like nothing bad's going on at home. You're good. I was like, oh yeah. She said, great. So now that we've got that out of the way, this story is awesome. And I think you're going to be a writer. Well, I had started writing my first novel my senior year of high school, and it was not Desert Places. It was this sweeping kind of family saga in the vein of Pat Conroy. It's like 200,000 words. It was not good, but it was my first like attempt to write something. And I started like a novel, and I started it and I finished it. And, but I realized pretty quickly as I started querying and getting responses back from literary agents that this was not going to go anywhere. And I started thinking about why I had chosen to write that when the stuff I was reading for fun and the stuff I loved was like Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon and a lot more of the sort of scarier pop culture fiction. And I thought, what if I wrote something like that?
Turning to that book, Desert Places, which would ultimately become your first published novel, is it true that you actually began writing it in your dorm room in University of North Carolina where you were studying English and creative writing?
I had watched this documentary in one of my classes about these three kids. I can't remember the name of it. Forgive me, but they'd killed this other kid in this really famous case in the South, and it was sort of a study in psychopathy. And I'd gone down this rabbit hole of reading some of like some FBI profiler books about all of the psychopaths they had interviewed in custody, and just how these people talked about seeing the world, and you know, understanding certain people had feelings, and you know, saw colors they would never see. And I just got really taken with this idea. And I thought, this sounds like a fun thing to write, not like trying to do something that maybe is outside my experience and wheelhouse. Like, I thought maybe I can do this. So I started writing that in, I think my sophomore year at college.
Was the premise of some cabin owner finding a dead body buried on his property a story you'd read in the newspaper or seen on TV in the news?
A couple years before I wrote or started writing Desert Places, I'd been on a backpacking trip to Wyoming. And we had gone to this, we were going into the Wind River Range from the west side and near this town. So, and as we were driving up, we were approaching this town called Pinedale. And, you know, it's all just high desert there, and with the mountains off in the distance. And I saw this road running off. We passed this dirt road that was just running off into the horizon. As far as like you could see for 10 miles, this road just going and going and going. And it always stuck with me. I even took a picture of it, and I kind of had that picture on my desk just because I thought it was cool. And so when I started wondering about, like, I had the premise of the book of this writer gets this letter that tells him there's a body on his property covered in his blood, and bad things will happen if he doesn't go dig it up and follow next steps. But I had no idea where he was going to be taken. I didn't know who was doing this to him. And as I was trying to piece these things together, I kept coming back to this photograph. I was like, what's at the other end of this road? What if it's this desert cabin out in the middle of nowhere? And what if he's being taken by someone, but who? And then I got the whole brother thing came to me, and then started, diving into that. And it became an interesting sort of family saga of its own design.
Was novelist Andrew Thomas the lead protagonist? A little bit autobiographical, given that's the profession you aspired toward yourself at that point?
It's a little wish fulfillment, writing about a guy who was much older than me at the time, like so old. He was like 34 years old. And just, had this career that I had kind of dreamed of having. And I had a lot of fun imagining his life, and I kind of used that as a way to go in and start to explore, not just like the profession I hope to have one day, but like the actual motivation behind why people write and choose to write the things that they do.
On the other end of the spectrum, did his ruthless adversary and protagonist, evil twin Orson Thomas, quickly follow?
Originally, the book ended with the evil twin and Andy Thomas being the same person, and the evil twin was sort of this manifestation of him. And I came up with this completely outside of my knowledge of Fight Club. And so Fight Club the movie came out that year. And when I saw it, I was like, oh shit, that's not going to work. So I dialed I made his evil twin into, a real person. And frankly, the book was better for it, because the gimmick of, that Fight Club relies on, I think, and yes, Fight Club's a book, but like, I think that works a lot better visually and in a movie, as opposed to a book where you've like actually been telling the audience this character is a living, breathing thing for 300 pages. I don't know. The suspension of disbelief was probably too much for me to really pull off.
To have your first book published right out of college is a leg up for any new author just getting started. And it proved to be a pretty quick realization of you putting yourself in the shoes of Andrew, albeit not with an evil twin on your tail.
Yeah, it was, I remember holding the book was very, very weird. The cover they had done, the guy looked kind of like me a little bit without a beard, which is weird. My mom even thought it was me when the book first came. She's like, that's cool. They put your face on the cover. I was like, Mom, that's a psychopath. But yeah, that never ever gets old, holding the finished book.
The Seattle Times would announce to readers when they opened the first page of the sequel, Locked Doors, that entertaining the picture is Blake Crouch's evilest killer. And from his name on down, Luther Kite gives everyone who meets him the chills. Without giving too much away, please introduce fans and viewers to this monster terrorizing Andrew on the page in the second novel.
I think they just were like, hey, why don't you, do you want to do another book? Do you want to do a sequel to this? It seems to lend itself to a sequel. And I was like, yeah, I think that'll be fun. So yeah, it was, I remember holding the book was very, very weird. He was a little offshoot of In Desert Places. Wow. I mean, you're making me dig up like the old school. I was always fascinated in the Silence of the Lambs, Red Dragon. I was always fascinated that, you know, there was like serial killers who sort of had knowledge of each other. And that always was really interesting to me. And I liked the idea that Orson in the book, the guy who kidnaps Andy, also, this isn't the first time he's done this. He's sort of groomed someone else, for lack of a better word. And so Luther was just sort of supposed to be a little window into that aspect of Orson and sort of the backstory there. And when I wrote him, he just came so full and clear formed. The only other character like that would be probably Letty Dobesh. But he really came fully formed, and I just loved the idea of this weird, spooky guy who was an enigma, but also very clear to me. And one of the things I knew I wanted to do in the sequel was like let him really step into the spotlight and have a let him fully have his close up, you know.
Breakyou finds Andrew hiding out in the woods way up in northern Canada with a family in tow, namely Violet King and their 4-month-old son. So the stakes remain as high as ever in what he has to lose here, especially after already losing so much in the first 2 books in the series. How complicated was writing this very ambitious, multi-point of view wrap-up to the whole series?
I was like taking notes and things back then, but I wasn't doing big outlines or anything like that, which was part of the problem. You know, that was a hard book. I ended up rewriting the last half of it, as I do many of my books. But no, I basically sketched out what I wanted to have happen. It was a little more ambitious than Desert Places because it had multiple character point of views. I was actually looking at that book recently, and I was surprised. I had forgotten that there were multi POV changes and even small little vignettes that, you know, comprised entire chapters of characters we never see again, just giving you a different angle on someone. But yeah, no, I did not outline that one.
Side by side with the success of this series, you began writing standalones during the same early era, kicking off with Abandon, which takes readers along with a crew, guides, a journalist, and a professor into what is purported to be an abandoned mining town with a blizzard in the background along with the rest of what awaits them without giving too much away. What was most thrilling about creating the kinds of twists and turns on the page you did here with an old mining town to play with?
I knew that I didn't want to keep just doing the same thing. I wanted to get away from the more horrific elements of Desert Places and Locked Doors. And Abandon was the first real, like, kind of big swing I took for a book. It was a dual timeline narrative, one set in 1893, one set in present day, had a massive amount of historical research. So a book that I was kind of afraid of and not sure I could do. It wasn't technically, when I wrote it, the book I was supposed to be writing. My publisher at the time wanted some more bullshit like I'd been doing. And I just couldn't get excited about doing that. So I went off and wrote Abandon. They were furious when I turned it in. But it was the right thing to do. It worked out, and it was a stepping stone to another layer, another level of my writing.
Did Famous represent another step in that evolution?
In Famous, interestingly, I wrote right around the same time as Desert Places. You know, I didn't publish it until many years later. It was self-published in, I think, 2010. I wrote it right after Desert Places because I was like, well, I just want to do something else cool. And I think you can kind of see that same, you can see that same like interest in like psychopathy and sort of that sociopathic behavior. It's expressed in a different way, but it's still there. And I think I was definitely going through something there where I was exploring characters like that for one reason or another.
Now, Run had an amazing countdown plot that really sets the book up for readers. What kind of advice along those lines would you give an aspiring thriller novelist of what makes for a great kickoff, so to speak, to the rest of the twists and turns that might follow in a story?
I wrote Run after Snowbound. Snowbound was something I had to do. Run was something I wanted to do, and I think it really shows in the writing. Run was, I had gone down a rabbit hole of genocides and was curious of how they started and how they came to be, why we didn't seem to have a lot of them in like really any history of them in America, at least on us. We did plenty of our own genocidal behavior on native populations. And there was something to me that became appealing to me about, like, I read this thing and it said that, they would start reading names over the radio in Rwanda. And people would literally hear names and they would just go to the houses and murder the people. And that detail really, really stuck with me. There's also I found it interesting that a lot of times as genocides unfold, historically countries don't do anything, like nothing at all. You can make your arguments for why not, we're not going in guns blazing to Ukraine. There's an actual huge nuclear threat looming, but there's no nuclear threat looming in, Rwanda. There's none looming in some of these other African nations where that's happened. I mean, we don't go in there. And I thought what would be interesting is to put a genocide into the center of America and play that out and see how we react to it. And I thought it was going to be a much broader scale story. Like, we'd see what the president's doing, all these other things. But as I started writing it, I just felt like the staying tight with this family's POV was a really compelling way to tell the story, to keep the focus just on them. And we only know what they know. And the idea of the lack of information being, one of the scariest things.
The New York Times was immediately and cinematically sucked into your next bestseller like anyone who dared to pick it up and enter what they framed as a portal into other dimensions of reality. Whereas you read it on paper, it inhabits a state of quantum transubstantiation or superposition. Please pull the curtain back for viewers who might not know of what the many worlds interpretation within quantum physics is, and how it inspired and impacted the writing of Dark Matter.
I didn't take any real scientific classes at university. It was all English and stuff, but I started really getting interested in quantum mechanics in the preceding 10 years before I wrote the book. And I was on a trip in Chicago hanging out with my buddy Marcus Saki, and we were having drinks and trying to figure out our next book while I was there. And I had pitched to him this idea of a box, and what if you could go into it and maybe it took you to another world. And immediately as I started talking about it, I just felt the power of the idea, and already started to see the characters. And I knew that it had to be my next book. I just felt something it felt really special.
Why was it important for the story to be told from Jason's first person perspective throughout?
Dark Matter was always first person present. Just needed to be.
Entertainment Weekly was equally entertained by the fact that Dark Matter has plenty of heady concepts and phantasmagorical plotting, but it is also beguilingly rooted in its hero's desperate travails, elevating this page-turning adventure to an entirely different dimension. How complicated was it writing two parallel Chicagos, and did you happen to prefer one to the other once you'd created them?
It was the hardest section of the book to write, because I thought going into it, these will be so fun to write. This is the reason to write the book, to get to these sections. But when I got to these sections, the first few worlds were amazing, but it got very episodic very quickly. And I saw that it was bogging the narrative propulsion down. So most of the edits on Dark Matter were spent cutting back the multiverse worlds, getting rid of universes, keeping that forward momentum racing on ahead.
Britain's The Guardian, in its review of your latest bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, predicted that you'd opened up a new and infinitely filmable world. And in fact, you're presently adapting this book into a screenplay for Apple TV. How do you make decisions on what stays and goes from the original book as you're writing it into a screenplay format? For instance, do you rewrite the dialogue or try to keep as much of that original material intact? It just all sounds so fascinating.
I've always loved the art form of screenplays. I really enjoy them. And for me, it's always been kind of a puzzle to crack. I have really not had any desire to jump into the show running world of Hollywood. there's a lot of stuff that comes with that has nothing to do with writing and creating story. But for Dark Matter, I love the story so much. I couldn't bring myself just to let someone else do it. I had a real, after struggling with the feature, I had a real sense of what would work and what would not work. So it just made sense to do it this time.
Well, at least you're in good hands with Apple TV as a partner.
Yes, and they're amazing. They're I think Apple's making some of the coolest sci-fi stuff today. I think Severance is like one of the best shows that's come out in like 10 years. And they are certainly, empowering us with what we need to make something at the highest level of quality.
Good Behavior, marked yet another novel of yours that was adapted into a TV series, this time for TNT, that ran for 2 seasons. Is it ever odd to see these characters you invented completely out of your imagination get brought to life by these incredible cast of actors on TV? And as with Wayward Pines, how day-to-day were you involved in this show's writing and production?
My friend Chad Hodge, who created Wayward Pines, we became really close during that process and thought, hey, we should do something else together. And even though Good Behavior and the character of Letty is so different from Wayward Pines, I knew Chad enough at this point to have a suspicion that he would respond to her. So I sent him the first short story. He's like, I love her. Let's do this. So yeah, we wrote a pilot together about this, meth addict grifter, and sold it and attached Michelle Dockery and had just a blast making a couple seasons of it.
Deadline was blown away recently by another of your bestsellers, Recursion, specifically with the typically brilliant hybrid you'd created here that's part save-the-world sci-fi thriller, part epic romance, as well as an intricate police procedural. But what fascinated many of us most was the medical affliction of false memory syndrome that the story revolves around at heart. Was that based on any real-life medical condition that you heard about that first got the idea spinning for this book?
No, I knew I wanted to write usually the way my book starts, I want to write something about genetics or quantum physics, or in the case of Recursion, memory. It just started with memory. And then I came pretty quickly to the idea that if we go back into our memories, it would be cool if you could get sort of trapped there and live your life forward from that point. But I was like, if I'm going to do something that verges into time travel, it feels like there's nothing, what is new to be said? And then I thought, and I call it the reverse Marty McFly. It's like, what if Marty McFly at the end of Back to the Future gets home and he's changed his timeline, but everyone remembers the old timeline? And what effect would that have on the world and their psychology and their neuroses? And once I had that, I was like, oh, this is cool. And that was off. Then it was just about finding out how to do the coolest version of this idea.
What can fans expect when they pick up your latest new release, Upgrade?
Upgrade was a pure desire to write about genetics.
When you first begin writing a new book like this, does the idea often come to you fully formed?
It doesn't happen nearly enough, as far as I'm concerned. When it does happen, it's wonderful. For me, it's like trying to create an environment where I can get to that space where it just like flows, and then it's like you can't get the stuff out fast enough. Usually for me, it's the other side.
Getting that call from Steven Spielberg is something any author dreams of. And when Amblin Entertainment called and said they wanted Upgrade, I imagine it was a no-brainer to say yes to that, no matter who else might have been bidding on it.
Dream come true. Dream come true. What's coming next? I'm working on the Upgrade adaptation for Amblin, a movie.
What else is in the pipeline for the near future, whether in TV or film or even books that you're working on right now?
Trying to get the Dark Matter going, which should start filming later this year in Chicago. And trying to find my way into my next book, which don't know what that is yet, but still fighting the fight to find it.
Finally, before we go, for the aspiring author that say dazzled on the one hand at the thought of even having a career like yours with so many great projects in development and production and new ones coming, could you give them a sense of what both sides of that process actually look like? In other words, behind the bright lights, what's the responsibility like actually maintaining a career like yours? And any advice for aspiring authors who have the same ambitions?
It's very, very tricky. At the end of the day, you have to write the books that you wish already existed. If you're lucky, there are other people out there who want to read those books too. I mean, it is as simple and as complicated as that. No, I'm not one of those writers who say I don't think about my audience. Obviously, I think about them. But at the same time, I don't, my like creative aesthetic and interests, I think are naturally aligned with sort of, at least they have been during most of my career, with what's in the mind of pop culture. Like The Win is as many people reading your books as possible. That doesn't mean you write whatever bullshit you want to write just to get people to read. I mean, I think it involves actually engaging people and trying to have a conversation with them. And if that's what you're trying to do, if you're trying to have a conversation, say, hey, here's how I see the world. Is this how you see it? Then anyone who tells you that it's not about getting as many people to engage in that conversation as possible is not being truthful. The little literary writers who are off, writing their quiet masterpieces and don't care about audiences. I like literally nothing could bore me to tears more. I want to talk about what is on everyone's mind, all the fundamental questions of existence. So that's been my approach. But that it's also like have expectations. Like if you are writing quiet novels, expect a quiet response. Now, and maybe you're fine with that. But you should ultimately be writing what you want to write. I write exactly what I want to write. I'm fortunate enough that it has an overlap with what a lot of people want to read. At the end of the day, it should be fun. It should always be fun. It's not to say it's not hard. It's very hard, but it should always be fun and you should always be having a blast. And if you're not, do something else. Like it's hard enough. Like don't do it unless you have to do it.
Blake Crouch, congratulations on all your success across so many different genres. We look forward to seeing everything you have coming up. And thank you for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Great interview.